Here we are at the second rendition, the second installment of the Teotihuacan cursory art history lecture. Let's just do a quick, for those who have not seen the previous lectures, just a quick review of the Teotihuacan kind of field that we're dealing with. So here are the incense objects, right? These are the objects that are in the middle of the apartment complexes that have these molded forms on them that can be rearranged. And then we have the hollow-bodied works, these kind of striking psychological sculptures, and that have also kind of mold-made objects inside of them. And here's an example of the mold-made clay ceramics from Teotihuacan. And here are the masks that we find in Teotihuacan, and we can compare these to what we've seen with the Olmecs in Mesoamerica. And then we have our paintings, right? This is my painting map of Teotihuacan, and these are ordered by the various apartment complexes and temples that they're found in. And so the upper left is the reproduction of a painting that's quite fragmented, and the reproduction exists in the museum in Mexico, in the Ciudad de Mexico. And these are all fragments of murals, right? A lot of the paintings were stolen and displaced. There's about 50 in the United States and close to 500 in Mexico, I believe, in different museums and collections. These two, this one is still in place, maybe, still in the architectural format. And these are all in situ. They're all exist in Tetitla. And then this is the amazing Atatelco that has been considerably restored. Temple of the Feathered Serpent. Another fragment. And I believe this one exists on site. So that's just to give us a quick kind of rundown of what we're looking at with Teotihuacan. Remember, it's this place that's known for the pyramids. It had it's thought to be a max population of 200,000. We're talking about these kind of massive, the pyramids are these massive exposés of human effort. And then next to that quite distracting feature of the pyramids is this elaborate city planning with these very understated objects and that have an eloquence, and there is not a single artifact that shows or expresses conquest. None of the paintings or artworks are similar in this way to the Zapotecs or to the Mayans, right? This is a first city, grid city plan that has at the same time has this kind of politic where there are no the only expressions of humans are as kind of humble servants to a god. There aren't these exposés of conquest. And anything else to say? Just to kind of it was a cosmopolitan city. And yeah, daily life was characterized by uniformity, simplicity, and mass production. And there's an absence of centralized authority of a supreme leader, no cult or dynastic power. So I just wanted to kind of give that. And then this is just going to be a brief intro of what the second lecture is going to be about, and it'll be in chapters again. So one of the things that I want to use, and that's what's kind of messy about this whole series of talks, is I'm using Mesoamerica to talk about other art ideas. And one thing is about reproduction meaning, right? So we live in this this special time where we are inundated with images, with a plethora of images, and we could think about that like a muffler on a car, right? A muffler has this series of baffles for the sound to travel through. and that muffles the sound or waters it down or distances it from us, or decreases the decibels. And we could think about that in a negative light, and that as we continue to play this game of telephone with images, and maybe we see a reproduction of a Michelangelo painting on a coaster, that's kind of the end of the line in some ways of how this thing has been reiterated and disseminated. But there's a whole new paradigm there that's worth looking at. And so I'm just kind of trying to reorient us a little bit in terms of what's been called the age of the simulacra. And so like on this slide, I have in the middle is it's an image of a reproduction of a Teotihuacan mural that only exists in fragments, which were themselves doctored and restored. Right. So you have this series of events, and then we look at this and decide how we feel about it. So I'm trying to get at that kind of emotional relationship to an artwork when we're seeing it after many iterations, and how we deal with that. We have to make a decision about how we feel about the original as for ourselves, and how to approach the object. What kind of specifics to pay attention to, because the color might be different. Things might have been moved. So we might not want to make decisions about what the thing is or what it means about a culture, if we're kind of whether in a discrete way or an obvious way, whether it's explicit or implicit, how much this thing has changed, right? You might not know that the colors have been changed. You make all these assessments and feelings about what the work represents, and or you do know, but you still make those feelings, have those feelings, and we have to decide whether to let ourselves have those feelings, and make those assessments and hypotheses about pretty big ideas, pretty important things about a culture. And then on the right, I have kind of the typical thing that also happens, is that these works exist in time, and then they get censored or changed based on the successive cultures that come after, right? Things are chosen to be looked at, and those things are then proliferated in the consciousness of that era that is looking at that artwork. So with the Sistine Chapel, it's gone through phases of renovation. And the one on the right, you can see that the glow of the green top shirt on the woman with that arc, that wooden arc object, has been added afterwards. It was decided that it was too risque to have a naked body like that, and that they should be covered with clothing. So suddenly I'm just trying to take apart these art objects as not being solid through time, neither physically or conceptually, right? They buckle and change with whatever each generation wants to lay on them as they kind of continue to exist through time, right? I'm just kind of unraveling the idea of this thing always meant the same, always was the same, always is. And that's a very important, wonderful part of looking at art and art history. And then on the left, we kind of go, we take this to the next level. It's an artwork by Richard Prince, the classic rephotographing of the Marlboro Man posters. And this was from the 70s. He's associated with this kind of rephotographing group of artists, but really just for the sake of this project, I'm just talking about images and reproduction and how we deal with that. So that's going to be one section of this talk. And then the next section, that's kind of using Teotihuacan to work within Teotihuacan and using it, which is messy. But that's also part of art history. And so I want to lay that into this talk, is that Teotihuacan is our first instance in Mesoamerica of mass production, right? We could talk about it like that. And on the bottom left, we have the molds and some things that are made from the molds, right? Press molds where you carve the negative, or you make a positive, then make a negative from it, then make more positives. So there's this kind of conceptual understanding of and need to reproduce many objects without as much influence from the hand. And that can mean a lot for a culture. Why would one want to do that? And why would one want to up a scale of production while reducing individuality? You could say that, something like that. So I want to talk about that with respect to Teotihuacan, but also the idea of scale. And so when you have a doll house, there's the understanding this is a sphere of play. and the scale functions in that way. And the scale could get larger, and it still speaks of play. But with respect to Teotihuacan, there's these objects that are made up of molds that insinuate with their scale this space of, we could say, agency, right? Like, what is the politic of a city where there are objects that are meant to be rearranged and organized with pre-made, molded, mass-produced objects. And so the feeling of agency is in the arrangement. And so within a controlled, all we have to go on in Teotihuacan is this ancient archaeological record, and we're restructuring what their society was like. But if there is this place of these incense burners within each apartment compound, it's a space of rearrangement, and that's a space for a citizen, a member of the community to express desires and have a certain amount of freedom within whatever the constraints are of conformity that is required when you live in a state civilization, in order for us all to get along. Especially, this is our first cosmopolitan, very close city, is a theory about it, right? So within that, you have this arrangement, and there is a history of talking about the picture plane and the artistic experience in terms of arranging objects on the surface versus the picture plane that we might think of with illustrative space, with the window of Alberti and the Renaissance. Instead, what if we think about the picture plane as hanging objects on it? So I have a picture of the refrigerator because that's kind of the classic example, and this could be extrapolated to the idea that when the picture plane is thought of like this, you're letting culture rather than nature. You're kind of accentuating culture and the ability to think of objects not necessarily as taking us somewhere else as representations or reference of nature. And within those two objects is this idea I have of scale, which is that something like Notre Dame and entrance, like how these citizens who are subjects, how they experience themselves or their communion with a god, right? Their transcendence, and the idea of a facade comes up in Teotihuacan, which is a special human moment in history, and how we walk through space, both with an art object and in architecture. And when we're presented with a doorway to walk through, what kind of introduction does that doorway make? So the idea of a facade in architecture, and you'll see it play out in the artworks. So that's the second topic. And the third topic I'm going to talk about is alternative ideas of city and state formation. So with the Olmecs, we talked a lot about how, using Robert Carnero's theory of conscription theory and the idea that states could have only come about through violence, in conjunction with the idea that there was nowhere else to go, that there was a boundary due to the environment. Teotihuacan offers, and there's some cool research about the idea, what about a self-forming city? What about alternate ways that a city could form? And there's a lot of strange clues in Teotihuacan that could help us as a culture deal with that. And so, yeah, like what was the impetus? What was the motivation for people to leave their homes and have this kind of mass exodus to Teotihuacan? Because it's not very well understood. There was a volcanic eruption, people left. Irrigation is often a theory that's given, who controls irrigation, but it seems like there is a lot of unknown about why the Mexican basin of Mexico would empty out to the degree it did. It's the first time in the history of the basin of Mexico where all the small farms were deserted and they came to Teotihuacan to live. And so I have the metaphor of the body and the cell walls and lipids. There is a self-forming process that I'd like to talk about in terms of simply the way the negatives and positives work to create a cell, to create a structure that has a boundary that allows access and kind of a cultivated environment. And within that also is kind of Lagos. Rem Koolhaas, this architect, has this amazing project where he goes to Lagos in the early 2000s, late 90s, maybe, I think early 2000s, and kind of talks about the structure of that city and how it forms. And what's interesting about it is his kind of inability to deal with it, and his honesty about that, and transparency of just not being able to make sense of what's happening in this crowded city that seems to lack structure. So those are the three kind of overarching umbrellas that I hope to get into. And yeah, if you watch this, then you can just click on whatever sections you want to remember from the talk. Thanks.